So good afternoon and welcome all of you. Special welcome to our guest, Professor Charles Taylor. It is a great honor and a high privilege to dialogue with him in person here in Trento. Charles Taylor has been conducting his research over decades, and his work has gone hand in hand with our philosophical lives. His books, starting from Hegel, have been the object of our reading and studying, master theses, PhD dissertations, workshops all around the world, and also in Italy and here in Trento. For this reason, I want to express my deep sense of personal gratitude to our guest, together with the gratitude of the students and of the colleagues in philosophy in Trento, and of course of the Department of Sociology, which is here represented by my colleague Sciortino. And also the gratitude of the entire Italian community of political philosophers, represented by the Italian Society for Political Philosophy, which I have the honor to lead. This event has been promoted by the Bruno Kessler Foundation in cooperation with the Department of Sociology and Humanities. And for us, the Department of Humanities, it is also the first meeting, the first lecture of the cycle of philosophical events entitled Voices from Contemporary Philosophy, which will give us the opportunity to meet a number of leading philosophers and scholars in Trento, starting from Professor Taylor, ending with Professor Honneth at the end of May. And we could not have hoped for a better start to this cycle. Special thanks also are due to Paolo Costa, who has made it possible and is one of the most authoritative and fine interpreters of the thought of several contemporary authors and of Charles Taylor in particular. Taylor has allowed us to better grasp and to rethink some fundamental concepts of modernity and perhaps the very way of understanding modernity in itself. And not only does the intellectual wealth of his work touch on the contents, it also touches on the method or the style. Charles Taylor has shown us what political philosophy is and what the very fact of being a political philosopher can mean. And this is not an easy task, as political philosophers are always confronted with the undefined identity at the crossroad of different fields and methods, moral philosophy, political science, political theory, the history of political thought. But eventually, when asked what political philosophy is today, we can answer, well, political philosophy is what Charles Taylor did and does. So finally, I would say that Charles Taylor's philosophy is also an excellent example and model of an embodied and engaged philosophy. At the end of the first book of Utopia, Thomas More says that if philosophy wants to win the year of princes and the year of the people, it certainly cannot dress itself in the garb of Philosophia Scholastica, formulating abstract principles. More says, we do not need a declamatory philosophy, but an alia philosophia civilior. That is another philosophy, more civic, more passionate about the lived historical human experience, more able to live with human imperfections while remaining committed to finding new spaces for personal and collective freedom. Well, Charles Taylor's philosophy is definitely an excellent example of this alia philosophia civilior. So thank you very much for being with us tonight.
It is really a pleasure to welcome Professor Sciortino in this room and this department for several reasons. First, because he's Sciortino, and that's pretty much a good reason, but also because I think very few philosophers have had such a large impact on social sciences and on theoretically oriented social research than Sciortino. I'm biased because I entered graduate school in '89, so Sources of the Self was really had a lasting impression on my training, and maybe Sciortino is guilty of some of my weaknesses because it was really one of the leading figures which I read for most of graduate school. And after I worked on migration, so I met, of course, Sciortino as a series of multiculturalism. I'm really deeply grateful to him, and I think it's been a really great honor to be chair of this department when you were here. So, Paolo, you're much better competent than me in introducing this scientific work.
I can do a good work because I'm doing it in Italian. So I will shift to English after a few words of introduction. Mi scuso per la voce, inconvenienti della stagione, è quello che mi è rimasto della mia voce, insomma, ma non siete venuti qui per sentire la mia voce, quindi potete pazientare qualche minuto. Mentre io faccio la cosa più scontata, cioè esprimo la mia gioia non solo per la presenza qui oggi con noi di Charles Taylor, questa è un'ovvietà lapalissiana, ma anche per il fatto che l'organizzazione di questo evento è condivisa dall'istituzione per cui lavoro, la Fondazione Bruno Kessler, e dall'Università di Trento. La mia gratitudine per l'entusiasmo e anche la velocità, devo dire, con cui Giuseppe e Michele, il professor Sciortino, il professor Nicoletti hanno accettato la mia proposta è profonda e sincera. Tra le molte cose che ho imparato in questi 30 anni da quello che considero il mio maestro, c'è anche una concezione della filosofia che lui stesso in un articolo pubblicato qualche anno fa sulla Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung ha definito una concezione non autarchica della filosofia. In questo scritto, che io cito ossessivamente nei miei lavori, Taylor ha notato che magari ci saranno anche degli ambiti del sapere in cui uno può aspirare a un ideale di autosufficienza epistemica, ma questa non è certo la condizione in cui si trova chi lavora nell'ambito della teoria sociale o della filosofia politica. In questo ambito la collaborazione e la curiosità interdisciplinare, il parlare molte lingue, è un requisito essenziale, fondamentale. Ciò dipende anche dal fatto che, diciamo, molti dei temi chiavi della teoria sociale e della filosofia politica travalicano sistematicamente i confini della comunità scientifica. E ne è un esempio canonico il tema scelto dal professor Taylor per la sua conferenza oggi, cioè la democrazia, il presente e il futuro della democrazia. Il tema, peraltro, è un crocevia in cui si intersecano molte delle linee di pensiero da cui sono derivati i contributi più originali della riflessione di Taylor. Quindi temi centrali per l'ontologia sociale, l'antropologia filosofica, la storia delle trasformazioni dell'identità moderna, la questione della laicità della società e dello Stato. Il fatto che la sua conferenza si intitoli Degenerations of Democracy al plurale basta già, secondo me, per stuzzicare la nostra curiosità. In quanti modi, per quali vie e per quali cause possono degenerare le democrazie contemporanee? Il titolo della lecture è anche il titolo di un recentissimo libro scritto, per così dire, a 6 mani da Charles Taylor con Craig Calhoun e Dilip Gaonkar, che sono 2 interlocutori e collaboratori storici del professor Taylor. Questo mi dà lo spunto per chiudere la mia breve introduzione, ricordando 3 pubblicazioni recenti in italiano del nostro relatore. La prima, non so se la conoscete, si intitola Una nuova democrazia ed è un libro uscito per una casa editrice molto nota in questa sala, Il Margine. Anche questo è un testo scritto a più mani che si propone di rilanciare l'idea e la pratica di una democrazia partecipativa. In un ambito diverso si può leggere un'anticipazione del libro che Charles Taylor sta scrivendo sulle poetiche romantiche in questo volume, che è un tributo che io stesso ho curato in occasione del suo 90° compleanno. Il titolo del libro dice un po' tutto: Modernità al bivio, l'eredità della ragione romantica. L'ultima cosa è sull'ultimo numero degli Annali di Studi Religiosi, la rivista del centro per cui lavoro, potete scaricare gratuitamente la traduzione di un saggio inedito di Charles Taylor dedicato a un altro tema cruciale del presente, il progresso morale dell'umanità, o meglio, come lui lo chiama, il moral growth, usando un termine meno compromesso dalle contraddizioni della storia moderna degli ultimi 2 secoli. E prima di passare la parola al nostro relatore, consentitemi di dire solo 2 parole sul progetto di ricerca Resilient Beliefs, da cui trae origine questo evento. Il progetto, che è finanziato dall'Euregio, che io, Boris Reme e Eugenia Lancellotta stiamo portando avanti da alcuni mesi in collaborazione con l'Università di Innsbruck e lo Studio Teologico Accademico di Bressanone, ha al suo centro proprio quei fenomeni umani che potremmo descrivere come un irrobustimento delle credenze, un irrigidimento talvolta delle credenze, a volte un semplice rafforzamento delle nostre opinioni, che credo hanno sicuramente qualche relazione con la questione al centro della relazione che ascolteremo tra pochi secondi. I shift now from Italian to English and I give the floor to Professor Taylor. Let me just repeat how glad and honored I am and we are to have you here with us in Trento, and how much we are looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the present and the future. Something so important to us, to all of us, such as democracy, self-rule, popular sovereignty. So thank you very much, everybody, and Charles especially. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Paolo, for that very positive presentation of myself, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm particularly grateful because, let me make an admission at the beginning, I want to talk about democracy, but the democratic world is very wide and it includes very many diverse democracies. I mean, you think of India, Indonesia, many countries in Africa and in Latin America, and so on and so on and so on. Necessarily, our experience is limited, and I have to admit right now that my experience, what I'm really drawing on, what I and my 2 colleagues in this book that Paolo just mentioned drew on, is a rather narrow range of societies in the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, really, we're 3 authors, one Indian, one American, one Canadian, so that's a little bit of a breadth. But it must be said that our consciousness of the present crisis is largely formed from the experience of the US and Canada, and the UK, France, Germany, and is much less informed by the experience of this country, of Italy. And so one of the things I'm looking forward to in this exchange that we'll have after I've finished talking is precisely filling in some of my very shaky knowledge of the Italian scene. So with that apology at the beginning, with that acceptance of the narrowness of scope at the beginning, I think it's worthwhile looking at what has gone wrong in the major countries I mentioned, and we can move out from that to see if that helps when one looks at other contexts. Now, the second important point that I want to make, which I can make very briefly, is that democracy is never something that is established once and for all. We throw off authoritarian rule and we set up a constitution with elections and so on. Democracies are always moving. They're moving forward and becoming more perfect and getting rid of obstacles, or they are sliding backwards and becoming sclerotic in various ways. And one of the things that I want to describe here is the becoming worse, if you like, is the deterioration of many of our Western democracies from the after Second World War period to today, right? That something very bad has happened in this period. And let's look at the post-war period. And there you had, partly because of the terrible experience of the 1930s and the Depression, partly thanks to the solidarity created in certain countries by the war, or solidarity created by the necessity of reconstructing these countries that have been destroyed, you had developed a much more balanced society between the power of elites and the power of the non-elites, in this case, mostly working class. It was a society in which there were strong trade unions, a society aimed at full employment, looking back at the terrible experience of the 1930s, Depression, a society which built or expanded a welfare state, and which is a society which had much less inequality, much more equal society than had existed before in the 1930s. But then around the 1970s, we started in most Western societies to move away from that. And what you find is that more and more, the importance of solidarity, social solidarity across all classes was neglected, was forgotten. And you have societies up to today, or a very recent past, starting from the 1970s and moving to today, which you could describe the mentality by looking at a certain number of ways of conceiving of society, as it were, frameworks. One is the neoliberal framework, the idea that everything can be arranged properly by the operation of impersonal markets, and we don't want to interfere with those markets because we want them to make the maximum welfare and maximum production, right? That's the idea that Hayek had and that became more and more popular. So neoliberalism and markets. Secondly, a certain conception of meritocracy, that is the jobs go to people who really have the competence to do that. But this turned out to be a kind of collective illusion of well-educated people occupying managerial and professional posts who thought that their meritocracy was already in place, and so I have the place I have because of what I deserve, how excellent I am, and so on. And the people who don't have this situation, well, it must be in some way their fault. And this kind of mentality, neglecting solidarity and a little bit, as it were, self-satisfying, it meant two things. Neoliberalism meant that our social priorities became very skewed, very off what they ought to be, because there's no doubt that what markets can do, you just allow the market to operate, they can certainly have developed the most efficient production of goods that are usually made by corporations, that is, goods and services for individual use. Right? So if you want to get the maximum production of individual goods at the cheapest price, then let the market work. And if this means that some people are put out of work here and the factories move to quite another country and so on, then so be it. But what this does is it skews your social priorities, because how about the development of the public sector, the development of the health system, the development of all the institutions which are coping with the difficulties of old age, and our societies are becoming more and more, I know this very well from my own experience, societies are becoming very much older. Well, these necessarily in a neoliberal society are squeezed, because if you raise the taxes in order to make them more satisfactory, the danger is that the industries will just move elsewhere, right? So there's a kind of race to the bottom going on, in which the type of expenditure you need to have a really effective, let's say, health system is more and more squeezed. And at the same time, you have developing in this kind of society greater and greater inequality. We can see this today, that inequalities are not only gigantic compared to 20, 30 years ago, but they're also steadily increasing, right? As people with lots of money make more, even more money, and so on. Now, so we discovered it's the pandemic which really woke a lot of us up, because in the pandemic, suddenly it became terribly important to have a really adequate health system which could deal with a massive health crisis. And in all Western societies, some more than others, yes, but in all Western societies, we discovered that we didn't have that, and we had to run or move as fast as possible. And even then, we didn't really make fully the kind of effort we could have made with a more developed health system. So we have what I want to call, between, let's say, 1970s and just yesterday, I want to call this the great downgrade, the downgrading of the living conditions and possibilities of non-elites, really of workers in almost all Western societies. And another aspect of this downgrade is that there was another development which we didn't have any even sense of, needed to be in some way reacted to, and that is the, I don't know if that's the case here, but in UK, Germany, and in all North American societies, you get a concentration of population in a few large centers. Take the UK case. It's really the southeast of England, the area of London, at the expense of life in other communities which shrink. They shrink in all sorts of ways. Population sometimes moves to the centers, but more than that, the various institutions that existed in these societies, the modes of sociability, the local newspaper, and so on, disappeared. And you have another kind of tremendous imbalance, where areas that feel that they've been totally neglected, they're being bled of their lifeblood as people move to the center. If you, a really clear case of this and of its importance for the present political situation is the UK, where it's very clear that it was the hinterland to London, which voted Brexit, right? Voted to get out of the EU in a kind of not very well conceived as it were, punch back at the existing conditions, and the elites from the South, which were telling them Southeast that they should stay in the European Union, that was what, in a certain sense, motivated the pushing back against the elites, which eventuated in that vote for Britain leaving the European Union. So we have this very unfortunate deteriorating situation which was going on in the last decades. Now, why didn't people vote against this? Why didn't earlier a lot of people who are not advantaged by this, whose life was made worse by this, why did they not simply vote against it? After all, we live in a democracy, right? Majority, if the majority is not doing well, they should find a way of voting. And here we get the second big theme I want to pick up here, which is not very easy to understand, but it's certainly the case that there developed a kind of opacity of the system for many of the people who operate in it. Many of the, for instance, the workers become less and less clear what the mechanisms are that they might be able to use to change policy, change government policy in a more favorable direction. Now, why? I mean, startling examples of this exist in the American case, Trump. Trump was elected in large part by workers who had precisely suffered downgrade, workers in what people have called the Rust Belt, that is the area which formerly had very big industries which were deserted and rusting away, and the people in those areas, let's say the Middle West, Michigan and so on, didn't have jobs or only had, part-time jobs, very, very precarious jobs. And they voted for Trump. Now, one of the things that Trump said he wanted to do was to destroy, was to totally do away with the health care system that Obama had brought into place, right? Why did so many people whose lives would have been worsened if they succeeded in voting out Obamacare, why did they vote for the Republicans? Why did they, the first thing the Republican majority under Trump did was to introduce tax reform, which lowered taxes on the very rich and on corporations and not on ordinary individuals. And the second thing they tried to do was to do away with Obamacare. And that finally didn't work because although the reaction to Obamacare started right after Obama's first period, even in the midterms in 2010, people had not had any experience of it. Whereas by the time we get to 2016 and Trump wants to do away with it, enough people had experience of it that they began to write to their member of Congress and say, just a minute, think about this again. But why didn't they see it right away? Why did it take that? Well, I think we've learned a big lesson from that. The system always becomes opaque when you don't have relays between the individual down here and the government, the state, the elected people there. Relays, institutions like trade unions, institutions like political parties, which are large membership parties, and just discuss what is going on, and people form opinion on the basis of discussing them. All you have is me, I'm the individual, and I know that it's not going well, and I don't quite see what I can do about it. I don't know who to vote for because there aren't these relays, the intermediate bodies in the society, which are needed. That's lesson number one, perhaps, that we can draw from this, that if we want to revivify our democracies, we have to recreate. I don't know what the situation is exactly in Italy about this, and I'll learn perhaps in the discussion. But in the countries that I'm familiar with, we have to reconstitute these intermediate organizations, perhaps on a different basis. I mean, there's a discussion in the United States now, very interesting. Do we want to concentrate on rebuilding the trade union movement in its present form, where it's organized around places of employment? Or do we want to have broader type of workers movement, where we take in lots of different people, even people in the gig economy, right? And together pool the resources to fight all our different fights, but not organize this around workplaces? I think that's probably a very, very significant development. Or there's another kind of development which really must be, I think, multiplied in more places. In some areas, there are people who are very good at organizing and bringing people together to discuss with each other, to take soundings and make polling in their area and discover what kinds of work people want to do, what kind of skills they want to have, and then put together a local regional organization which tries to create that, and above all, creates a program that they can ask of state and federal government and so on. That's the kind of thing which actually I and two other people discussed in another triple book about democracy at the base. But you see, that's one of the lessons, is that we need that kind of democracy at the base if we're going to have functioning democracy at the level of the whole society. That's the second lesson. The third, though, thing I want to talk about is what really is giving us the most trouble today. And that is the battle in many countries over, if you might call, the political identity, right? Political identity is what we all accept that we share as Italians or French or Germans or Canadians or Quebecois or Americans. What is our society really all about? And what we at present see in a lot of Western societies is a big battle over this identity between two sides which seem to allow no compromise between them. One is those who want to have a very inclusive idea of identity, in which all kinds of differences can be brought together. People of all kinds of difference can be brought together. And on the other side, you find people who are very ill at ease with this and find that some kinds of people really perhaps shouldn't be full members of the society, or maybe they ought to be there only in an inferior position. Now, there are two kinds of ways in which this kind of exclusionary sentiment grows. The first concerns areas or countries which have not had a lot of experience of immigration in the past, and where suddenly a lot of people are knocking at the door. And this is unfortunately created by the world situation today. There is pressure for migration of a never precedented, never experienced before, because of refugees fleeing various situations, partly fleeing war situations like Syria, but partly fleeing situations created by climate change. And the things created by climate change partly include the wars that happen, like in the Africa Sahel region, right, where desertification is creating a situation in which pastoralists who operate by taking care of their flocks face over against agriculturalists who want to use the land to grow crops, right, and find that they're more and more squeezed, and that this produces a kind of war between these two modes of life. And so it's the conflict and climate change work together. Climate change increasing conflict, increasing the desire to escape. And it's frankly a fact that in countries that are not used to a lot of immigration, it's very worrying, very destabilizing. And I don't want to moralize about this. I just know it, I can recognize it as a fact. And, you know, if you cross the Atlantic, you recognize this. Transatlantic Western Hemisphere societies have mostly been engaged in accepting immigrants for a century. This is not just Canada and the States, this is Peru, this is Argentina, this is, Chile, this is Brazil, and so on, right? Whereas a lot of European countries haven't had the same experience, so it comes as a kind of shock. And I don't, as I say, I don't want to moralize about this, but it does create a very bad situation in which, for instance, take the German case, Angela Merkel's decision to take a lot of Syrian refugees created a reaction which emerged politically in the Alternative for Deutschland, right, which has an extremely exclusionary view about this. In our countries in the Western Hemisphere, there's another origin of this kind of exclusionism. And that is really that from about the 1960s on, there came to be a reaction against various kinds of, you might say, hierarchical inclusion. A sense that certain people, certain citizens are kind of a little ahead of others and more priority rights than others. And think of the various ways in which this existed. For instance, all of men felt that the jobs, certain kinds of jobs, should be theirs, shouldn't be competed with, they shouldn't have to compete with women. And they even had a sense that their dignity was a little bit shaken by the idea that, well, a woman can do the job as well as I can. I have to prove that I'm better at this. Or whites in relation to blacks in the United States, this deep sense of, yeah, they're there, it's okay, but they're there if they stay in their proper place. Or people who feel like settlers against indigenous populations, which we have in both Canada and the States, right? And we are again discriminations against people on the grounds of homosexuality and so on. Well, around the 1960s, actually in almost all Western societies, there came to be an immense movement against these modes of discrimination. And what we've seen is that these movements create a backlash. That's all the people who felt that their dignity and importance and recognition depended on their acceptance of their slightly superior or very superior position, moved against this, and they found perhaps various other ways of justifying that. And in the American case, it's this very odd idea of conservatism that they have and so on. And we've had this kind of tremendous battle around this. And this is perhaps the second or most salient problem of our society, because it's produced societies like the US, which are very deeply polarized, right? And because they're polarized by different understandings of the national identity itself, there isn't a rallying point which would exist if everyone accepted some common notion of the national identity of our basic values and so on. Then you could argue about this and find some way of compromising with different views and so on. But if you have these radically different views of the national identity, neither side really wants to compromise. I mean, this is in various ways, each one thinks the other is asking that one betray one's basic principles. And we have this tremendous polarization. And you take certain cases like the US, the Trump rebellion is to be understood as the result of a combination of factors. Combination of people resenting and angry at what I call the great downgrade, the fact that they don't have the same standard of living as they and their parents had, or they had before, on one hand, and this kind of backlash against egalitarian reforms on the other. So how do you get beyond this? Is this insurmountable? It certainly appears that way. But I want to end with a vision of a possible way out. And the possible way out would have to come from some kind of ethical shift, right? Let's look at the attempts to overcome this kind of gulf that we see with Martin Luther King and the movement that emerged from him, the civil rights movement, and that we see with John Lewis, who died very recently, who was a younger colleague of Martin Luther King, was for a long time an American congressman from Georgia. And the slogan that Lewis presented, he said to his white interlocutors, put down the burden of hatred. It's a very striking thought. The hatred, the prejudice, he's talking about the prejudice, the desire to exclude that comes from many whites. He's saying not give up your privilege. He's saying that what you think of as your privilege is actually a burden. It's actually crushing you in a certain way, because you have to lie to yourself in a certain sense into believing this kind of superiority, because many whites in America are actually afraid because they have a sense somewhere that they've done something not terribly good to the African-American population. So you see that every time a white policeman shoots down a black man, not every time, but most of the time, they actually are afraid that the black person will pull a gun, right? And they're afraid he pulled a gun because they have a sense that they must be angry at me. So what you see as a privilege is actually a burden. But the third reason why it's a burden, because you have to be a little bit untruthful to yourself, and it's a burden because you live in a kind of fear. It's a burden for another reason. It's a burden because, as a matter of fact, diversity can be an immense source of richness. What we can do together if we're diverse is something much greater than what we can do on our own. I mean, I think really the example is when you look at a society where there really is mutual acceptance of difference today, and that's the Ukraine. This has been created, of course, partly by the challenge of the Russian invasion. But I remember visiting the Ukraine in 91, just after their independence, and was still uncertain how the Russophone, people who speak Russian and people who speak Ukrainian, how the ones who are connected to the Russian church, the ones connected to the Ukrainian church, how the ones connected to the Uniate church would relate. It was very unclear how all this would work out. In a certain sense, the very behavior of Russia to the Ukraine, culminating in this invasion, has helped to create this sense of unity in the Ukraine, because they suddenly saw that they had something in common. They had developed in the course of fighting back against this and against corruption, a sense of what they could do together, reaching out across their differences. So now you have, I mean, Putin talks about the Nazis. We have a Jewish Russophone president of Ukraine, and everybody is behind him because they have this sense that they can do things together that they couldn't do if they were divided between Russophone, Ukrainophone, etc. See, it's that sense of what we can do together, what we can create together, the richness that we draw on if we work together. Now, is this totally a dream? The Ukraine case shows it isn't, but even in our societies, you can see, I believe, among younger people, there's a much greater consciousness of how diversity, how difference, bridging difference, meeting other people can be a richness. As you move down the age group, you find more and more younger people. And this is the case also in my society, which I don't want to go into. And I'm talking about Quebec now, not Canada. The polls show that discriminatory legislation which the government has passed against Muslims is less and less and less popular as you move down, because people recognize that on that level, that difference is a kind of richness. And this is what I want to call an ethical vision. By that I mean a vision of what a full human life can be. What is not just a matter of what's fair between you and me, but a matter of what a really fulfilled human life, rich human life can be. It's that kind of vision which could get us out of our present impasse, our present blockage. And it's that kind of vision which implicitly Martin Luther King was appealing to, which implicitly John Lewis was appealing to. And so perhaps we could see a moment in which this kind of vision can become powerful enough to bring about a reunification of whole populations that are at the moment totally at loggerheads. Yes, this is not something already done. It's something that hoped for, but I think it's really worthwhile examining. So I've tried to give a picture of what brought about the present impasse, and also a hint at what could lead to our overcoming it. This may not have much application to your situation here, but I'm very, very glad to have the possibility to talk to you about this. So thank you very much for your comment.
Thank you very much, Charles. Se siete d'accordo, adesso apro la discussione, ma magari faccio un riepilogo veloce del ragionamento di Taylor, per darvi anche il tempo per mettere a fuoco le domande. Taylor è partito dall'ammettere che il fenomeno democratico, che non è mai un fenomeno stabile, è sempre un processo di crescita e regressione, è per natura un processo plurale. Quindi quando uno parla di democrazia, e se vuole partire dall'esperienza, parte da molti esempi di democrazia. E gli esempi di democrazia che lui ha utilizzato nel suo libro sono una selezione di esempi, tra i quali manca quello italiano, per cui lui è molto curioso di sapere da noi se la sua interpretazione della traiettoria degenerativa della democrazia negli ultimi 30 anni corrisponde alla vostra e mia esperienza. Allora, la traiettoria, appunto, ve la potete immaginare, è un processo di crescita, il secondo dopoguerra, in 30 anni, in cui il criterio con cui misurare la crescita è la capacità del sistema di includere gli strati della popolazione meno fortunati. Quindi una crescita di uguaglianza e anche di una forma di empowerment, di crescita di partecipazione. E questo processo di crescita a un certo punto negli anni 70 si interrompe, e il segno distintivo dell'interruzione di questo processo, che lui identifica con uno slogan, il Great Downgrade, è che al mercato, sia simbolicamente che realmente, viene riconosciuta l'autorità per decidere cos'è bene e cos'è male, anche all'interno dei processi deliberativi democratici. Quindi, diciamo così, ciò che è compatibile col mercato va bene, ciò che non è compatibile col mercato non va bene. Ma la domanda che si è fatto Taylor a un certo punto è: perché non c'è stata una reazione popolare dai perdenti di questo Great Downgrade? Le sue risposte sono: la prima è che Se gli individui hanno un rapporto con il sistema, uno contro il sistema appare opaco, irrimediabilmente opaco, e l'opacità genera un senso di impotenza. L'impotenza, diciamo così, un antidoto all'impotenza ovviamente è rapportarsi al sistema non singolarmente, ma come un gruppo di persone. Ma proprio le istituzioni intermedie, tipo i sindacati, entrano in crisi in quel momento e questo tipo di antidoto non funziona più. L'altro problema è l'enorme polarizzazione tipo identitario che le società sperimentano in questo periodo, che crea fratture all'interno della società che non corrispondono alla distinzione tra vincenti e perdenti del great downgrade. Questo appunto, per esempio, l'esempio più classico ha a che fare con paesi che sperimentano ondate di migrazione che sono un fenomeno storicamente nuovo per loro. Questo crea forme di esclusione, di competizione, soprattutto tra i perdenti nuove, che non permette che cosa? Il vero antidoto che alla fine della sua riflessione Taylor ci ha proposto, cioè l'idea che sia possibile una specie di rivoluzione etica, ma non di tipo, come potremmo dire, puramente altruistico, ma è l'idea che si possa scoprire come una sorta di gestalt shift, che se vedi le cose in maniera diversa, cioè se vedi nella diversità una ricchezza, puoi fare un'esperienza, diciamo così, di empowerment, chiamiamo, di potenziamento delle tue capacità, che ti dischiude orizzonti che non avresti potuto nemmeno immaginare. E proprio questa possibilità di vedere, per esempio, per i privilegiati, che il loro apparente privilegio in realtà è un fardello dal punto di vista etico, perché gli impedisce di sperimentare questa ricchezza della diversità, secondo professor Taylor, potrebbe essere una soluzione. Alla fine si è chiesto, è solo un sogno questo? Lo ha chiesto a ciascuno di noi, e quindi io passo la parola a voi. Non so se useremo, penso, usiamo questo microfono, perché chi vuole fare la domanda venga pure qua. Se volete farlo in italiano posso tradurre anch'io.
Grazie, me la cavo. Thanks very much for the talk. And I like to start exactly when you started and ended with war. And as much as unpleasant as the idea is, war historically has been an important factor in the extension of democracy, and in particular in the fight against inequality. It worked with Bismarck and Second World War and introduction of the welfare state. So my cynical view is that ultimately democracy works perfectly fine when it's able to exclude huge sectors of the population. That was for the US. In British democracy that we kept as a model for a long time was based on mechanism of exclusion. And in both cases, what happens that the model breaks up and is expanding? When precisely there is the need to build solidarity on the occasion, when you need to secure the loyalty of the lower class, because you need to send them to the front, you need to send them. So my fundamental question is, if I put it very sharply, beyond wishful thinking, can we think of serious ways to reassemble broad solidarities without a serious threat from the outside, as much as unpleasant as the prospect of war is? Maybe global warming and the catastrophic effects we might act as a substitute, perhaps.
Actually, you're making 2 points, I think. One is that a great many democracies, well, all governments based on representative government up to now have been, or perhaps very recently past, have had huge inequalities. And this has worked because for a long time, the people excluded or given inferior position accepted that. I mean, you take something like British society, for a long time, people had a certain deference with those, for those who were in the upper classes and so on. So they felt sometimes, disadvantaged by what was legislated, but they thought that was fine and was okay. And the same thing, similar thing existed in the United States and less in Canada, but nevertheless. So that is one fact, but the thing about that is it's not tenable in the long term. Particularly if you have universal education and so on, that kind of situation depends on the people on the lower ranks accepting it. But the second point, I think it's a separate point, but it's a very important point, that solidarity among all classes is sometimes created by fighting against an external enemy. Well, in a certain sense, we're not entirely out of that situation, because you say that one very important thing is the danger of global warming, but also because even if you take the kind of struggle the way Martin Luther King and John Lewis took it, we're fighting against, in a certain sense, a spirit which is still abroad in the society. So trying to establish that there's a richer way of life, which involves really accepting and taking on board diversity. And so this is something where the struggle lines don't simply exist between these people and those people, but they run through us in various ways and through our institutions. So there's a struggle there, but it's not the same kind of thing as a war against an enemy. Right?
Thank you very much. My question is very much related to your idea of exclusion and inclusion, and to the solution that you're actually suggesting about the problem of exclusion in our societies. And I was wondering whether we could look in a more specific way into market institutions, meaning that to me is not necessarily the distinction between private organizations and market organizations and organizations that are within the public realm, the public sector, that determines exclusion. Meaning that the fact that an organization is a state organization or public doesn't mean that it is inclusive. It might be governed in a very exclusive way. And so market organizations, I'm thinking about the social and solidarity economy, which is purposefully designed to actually include people and include stakeholders and weak categories. Although they stay on the market, they might be very inclusive. So on the one hand, we have this very progressive idea of improving inclusion in our economies and societies. On the other hand, we need to design the institutions for that, I think. And in particular, we need to look at production institutions, to me, not only at intermediate organizations in our societies, because that's where most of the time we have in our society spent is within production organizations. So really, my point is, we need to go beyond the distinction between private sector and public sector, in my view, and think about new forms of organizations that are inclusive, whether they are public or private, with a view towards inclusion and purposefully designed for that.
I mean, that's a very important point, because you're talking about the various forms of, well, it's actually, I think the word exclusion, I'm now saying, is not quite the right word. It's the idea of hierarchical inclusion. People are included, but in a lower, right. So, and that's really what the big thing we're fighting against. I mean, in some cases it's really exclusion, but in some cases it's hierarchical inclusion. And this is very rife in the private sector, right? There may be lots of firms that don't in fact promote women, lots of firms that don't in fact, etc. So, and there the battle is maybe the wrong word, but the struggle is something that's much harder to envisage. So what you have to have is a change in the culture that's big enough that people running these private companies find that it's bad for their company to stand out as ones in which women never get named to the board of directors or whatever, right? And it's that kind of fight for struggle about to form public opinion and to, in a certain sense, shame certain institutions, which is the way the struggle goes on, rather than in sort of direct issues of legislation and so on. So in this kind of change, you're right, the areas in which it either progresses or doesn't progress are multiple, and not simply in the field of legislation or in the public sector.
Thank you for your very, very enlightening talk. I have a question about the point you made about political identity. Okay, so why political identity has become so important now compared to the recent past? Now, there is some increasing evidence in many studies that phenomena like polarization in the US, for example, are actually more false polarization than real polarization. So people really overestimate the degree of distance that exists between them and another party. But because of the visibility that quite a few, a very noisy few, have, it kind of gives the perception that this distance is much larger than actually exists. But there is no way of bridging this distance, apparently. And perhaps is related to the other point you made of the disappearing of intermediary bodies. So I wonder how these things come together and why political identity among the different forms of social identity people have has become so important now. Thank you.
No, I think you're made a very important point there, set of points, that why political identity is important, I think, is because democracies depend on solidarities of various kinds. Now, frankly, I have a more social democratic understanding of this than most Americans do, but so I'm thinking in terms of things like the welfare state. But you know, even American Republicans accept FEMA, that is the organization which steps in when there's a terrible catastrophe. You know, a huge hurricane whips through Florida, and this federal organization sets to work. Now, see, so even Republicans who are very averse to supporting solidarity when it comes to helping people with their healthcare, don't have healthcare, they accept that here it's something important. So, but it demonstrates how important political identity is as a solidarity creating body. So what you have to do is move beyond accepting disaster relief to seeing that there are needs that people have, and that is not simply their fault, and that actually they contribute much more effectively to society if they're given a little help. If they're given a little help in bringing up, feeding their children and bringing up their children, the children end up being much more productive members of society, and etc. So it's there is the political identity always creates solidarity. The problem is to expand the areas in which solidarity operates, but without any sense of political identity keeping us together, you just wouldn't be able to motivate. That's my experience. You know, why should people in British Columbia help us in Quebec? And some of them are saying, why shouldn't we? But the answer to them is, we're all Canadians, and that works.
Ok, adesso si sente. Scusate. Okay, I repeat. I want to ask you a question about the process of direct democracy, because we here in Italy we had an experience of a movement, Movimento 5 Stelle, who tried to use the internet, the platform Rousseau, to create a link between the individual and the institutional, a direct link. Now, I don't want to say nothing if about the result, because everyone can judge by itself, but I want to ask you if, according to you, the new social the dimension, like even the metaverse that seems to came from USA, if this dimension can be a resource, a positive resource for the democracy, for the direct democracy, and not only a medium of alienation or isolation as often is represented.
See, I think that this is very important to attempt, but I think the Cinque Stelle formula doesn't work, because what you need is common deliberation, not just you give your opinion, give your opinion, but actually deliberating together. Now, there are methods of helping this along, which have been tried in various places, British Columbia and Ireland and so on. Consultative bodies. You try to get a body, and also Macron did something similar at the time of the, what do you call it, Gilets jaunes, right? But you have a group of people who are small enough to be able to deliberate together. I mean, it's 30, 40 people. And you make sure that it's constituted in a way which reflects the demographics, right? Okay. And then they can go at it and work over and get the argument straight. Because you always at the beginning say, well, let's do it this way. Well, no, that's not too bad, but this problem, okay? You work together and you fix that problem, you fix that problem, and you come up with a solution. In Ireland, they did this, so on, which can then be legislated or not, right? You don't decide, but you work through all the details that deliberation can work through, and you can then explain why you're proposing what you're proposing. I think we have to use that kind of technique, or as it were, institution, much more frequently. And this is one way of getting out to the more general population proposals that have been really thought through and debated, right? And you can explain, and people can go say that doesn't work. Well, we thought of that, or maybe we didn't think of that. We'll go back to the drawing board, right? And I think that is the route that we have to take, rather than simply saying, let's collect, what do you want? What do you want? What do you want? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Did you hear what I said? Okay. So we do have these relays. We haven't had any trade union busting, and trade unions are institutionalized. It's on company level, bipartite collaboration, on the state level, tripartism. And so we do have them. And we also, you know, we have a welfare state, which is called the social democratic welfare state. And from being one of the poorest countries in Europe, due to the oil and gas resources, we become very rich. So your tale is very different from mine. Because in Norway, being a small country, we haven't had an aristocracy, so equality is a central value, and participation, collaboration. So it's a very different story, but of course we are not an island. So we do have growing differences, and we also have workers voting for rightist politicians. So, but a very different story. But my question to you would be, because I don't think we could make a blueprint of how the Norwegian model is functioning, because it's due to historical reasons, to contextual issues as well. So how to revive the relays in other countries? That is very interesting to me. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I agree with you. I always admire the Norwegians because, you know, they've been under various aristocracies, which were Danish at one point and Swedish at another point. But as you say, it's a very egalitarian society. But I think that even Sweden is a fairly egalitarian society under recent social democratic rule. But something I mentioned earlier, which is the countries that are not used to living with a lot of foreigners are very, very destabilized. So in the recent Swedish election, unfortunately, in my view, unfortunately, social democratic government was put aside because there was a large number of people really voting against all these foreigners. I mean, and I think this is something we have to live with and get over. I mean, we have to somehow get people, or maybe their children, to see diversity as a source of richness, which it really can be. But the battle has to be started all over again. You know, in a sense, I mean, Norway and also Sweden are remarkable too for their contributions to international equality. I mean, the proportion of their GNP that they voted aid to less well has been really exemplary, right? And so, I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which things can go wrong. That's really much where I take your point to, but you have to work on those ways, and they remain beacons in some ways. So we all live it, but I'm a social democrat. So.
First of all, thank you for your interesting speech. You depicted a very polarized world, those in favor of inclusion and those more skeptical about it. And you also provided a solution. Basically, diversity and inclusion is a possible richness and a possible way to stop this democratic backsliding. But then I can see a problem there. So what about those less in favor of inclusion? How should we talk to them? How should we talk to those that feel that their status are threatened and they are scared about the diversity and cultural different opportunities? How can the state and the parties talk to them? How can they move them towards some more solution, because towards your solution, because basically they are alone out there facing this world. So how should we talk to them? And maybe a way out you provided that. You talk about the opacity in accessing the tools of making the system work. Maybe that can be a direction connected also to what you said before, but I will be glad to listen to your insight. Thank you.
So that's a long and arduous process, but you can see what it involves. First of all, it involves, in other words, more than one measure to fix it. It involves a kind of cocktail or a kind of combination of measures. And the recent American, the American last presidential election is a good example of that. What Biden did was not only put forward the agenda of diversity and inclusion, but he also appealed to a kind of identification. No, I'm one of you. I was brought up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, in a working class community. I understand you, and I have a program that can really do something for your condition. And the result is of that kind of appeal is that those crucial states that had tipped balance over for Trump in 2016, which is, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, they flipped. And that made a big difference. So that's part of the appeal, but it's only part. There are other ways in which you can work on this deep antipathy. And that's another kind of small group operation. If you get people to, maybe 30, 40 people, but half of them from one side, half of them from the other side, and they sit down and talk out what the problems are and what to do about them, you find it's really sort of chemical change occurs. More and more people recognize that they're really not that far away from people on the other side. What and of course this only affects a small number of people, but I think that we have to, a country like the States would have to have, and from the private sector, I suppose, promote a lot of these kinds of encounter. Right? And even on issues where people seem to be totally polar divided, like abortion, for instance, people have made experiments in this, get people from both sides. Let's talk for a whole weekend. What should we do about this? They find that they're not as far apart as they thought they were, that the others aren't demons and so on. There has to be an attempt to work on this at all levels, and particularly even on the non-political level. So what to do is really a whole lot of things. An appeal to a lot of those workers on a program that really would help them. Right? Some sense of some appeal to, anyway, younger members of that community who can answer the appeal to diversity as a richness. Some attempts to bring people together. It's a whole spread of different measures which you have to think of putting in place here to make some kind of headway. Sure, yeah.
Thank you so much, like everybody else, for the fascinating talk. I'm afraid I'm not Italian either. I'm British, as you can hear, but not close enough. Better? Okay, sorry about that. I wanted to very briefly ask and build on Professor Diani's question about constructing climate change as the kind of threat or problem that might drive reunification, and about how that might be achieved. Because in your talk, you mentioned social movements and also necessarily backlash against those movements. And I think we're seeing that definitely in debates about climate change. And then the second question would be, if we use climate change as that kind of unifying external threat, enemy, however we want to call it, is that going to drive international solidarity, which is so fundamental to actually doing anything about climate change, about seeing diversity at the global scale and creating political identity beyond national borders? because of course, if we see climate change through an extreme weather event, we might see a solidaristic kind of response. But when we need to help a mega biodiverse country with putting our money into the UNFCCC or the CBD, we tend not to do that. So how do we build the solidarity beyond the borders as well as within political units like states, I guess?
Well, I think we are actually building this solidarity by all these COPs. We had a COP on climate change as such, and then we had another COP 15 in Montreal on the preservation from extinction of vast numbers of species. And anyway, locally, these are very widely, the news about these are very widely diffused, and people understand them more and more. I think that understand that we really all belong together, all have to hang together. And I think it's one of the possible sources of bringing democracy together, so that the greatest dangers are political parties calling themselves populist want to deny global warming. But even in the States, this is less and less possible. The polls show that in spite of the effort of the Republicans to put that agenda on the side, majority of Americans recognize that climate change is a great threat. And how can they not, when parts of the country are burning and other parts of the country are drowning and so on. So the problem with climate change not really motivating people is a problem of what do I do about it? And most people feel powerless as individuals or small groups or families. And so I know with myself that after a while it gets so painful, you switch on the television and you watch the soccer game because you try to escape from that. So we need various mechanisms by which people can contribute to the effort, so that when they wake up feeling, we've got to do something, there's something they can do. They can give money to certain causes or whatever, something they can, certain organizations, or militate or send letters to the president or whatever, something they can do to, as it were, respond to that sense. If you leave them without any levers, then they will do what I find myself often doing. I want to turn off this really good book. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the opportunity of today. I would like to ask about the deteriorating of democracy. When you use that word, I thought of that I often heard about young people my age, and not just friends, but read around that there's like a feeling of emptiness and desolation around, which I don't think only affects young people, but it is general on a way. And I would like to ask whether this can also be due to that now we all depend on screens and everything is digital. And what about public spaces? Again, when you talked about parties and trade unions being weaker, right? So what about our local places, and what about living those places once again and using them once again in a democratic key perspective? So what is the role today of these public spaces, and how can we reinterpret them and embed ourselves once again in these public spaces we have for democracy as well? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think that a very striking example of using public space is the movement around Greta Thunberg. I mean, it's something really remarkable that young people, totally, in a sense, shamed people in my generation, but that's not the only way to look at it, but they really put it on the agenda and express their impatience, right? Tremendous impatience, impatience which as I say, people like me feel at various moments, and then we lapse from that because we can't stand it. But they hear there's an input from younger people, which I think made a really big difference, and allowed them to express the sense of a cause that's deeply meaningful to them. I think that a great many young people today are, they don't quite see a way to find real meaning in their lives, right? And not everyone's going to find meaning in this kind of public political. There's a very, very big issue where there isn't enough discussion of some of the deeper issues in the public sphere, right? For them to get a hook on something. Oh yeah, this is something I would like to pursue. But at least this issue here of climate change has been for a lot of young people. Yes, this is the beginning of something that really has meaning for my life and that I can do something about. And it creates also a sociability, a sense of being together with others. So it's in a certain sense tackling two immense problems in our lives today. The objective one out there, climate change, and the inner problem of finding some kind of meaning.
I didn't know what. Would you take another question? Yeah, I understand now.
Sorry, I think it's a question strictly related to the question just asked. This is the reason why I raised my hand. Thank you for your talk, Professor Taylor. I would ask you, what would you suggest to do in order to increase this sense of solidarity and the consciousness that diversity is a richness? Because solidarity, of course, is an ethical issue, but I think that it involves also a specific kind of self-understanding, a specific ontology behind it, that one cannot reach alone just through the smartphone, apart from social or communal practices that educate people to this different awareness of themselves. Thank you very much.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It needs the creation of solidarity needs movements which connect people, right? So I think that every time you get not just these movements for climate change, but there can be movements for greater social fairness, greater fairness in society. The people who are left out should not be left out. There can be movements where people point to the fact that certain populations, certain elements of the population have been just abandoned and forgotten, right? And these kind of movements are movements which turn solidarity from a general, vague sense of to something very, very concrete. Right? And so I think that it's a creation of these kind of movements, of these kind of demands, that make solidarity something living, and that make the sense of general solidarity something that's not only vaguely theoretical, yeah, that's true, but it's something you can participate in, and therefore becomes really very strong motivation for
it. If I am allowed, the last question, which what is left for my voice is, I would want to come back to the issue of the ethical revolution. Yeah, and I was wondering whether it makes sense to you that there may be a more political variety of this ethical revolution and more impolitical variety. I mean, you may see the way out as a personal solution or as a collective solution. Does it make sense to you, this distinction, and do you see it as an important, big issue here in our imagining a way out of the situation through this kind of ethical revolution or not?
The recognition of that diversity creates greater richness is something that you're unlikely simply to have it alone. You could, I mean, if you're just thinking, ethics, and you're looking at various places in history, but if you're a young person, it's likely that you get this intuition because you've actually met people that are very different, and you're exchange with them, and you're close to them, and you're ready to work with them, and so on. So it's that sense of the richness of diversity based on actual experience. Now, a lot of people think, my friends think that I'm totally crazily optimistic and so on, but and they may be right, but I don't want to think about that. But I think that you can see a future in which the creation of more contact results in a greater sense among all those people of the richness of this contact. And then that feeds on itself. Now, one of the places I really think I saw this happening after the murder of George Floyd in the States, and not only in the States, that's interesting. After the murder of George Floyd, there were naturally Black Lives Matter demonstrations. But unlike the Black Lives Matter demonstrations previous, they were not overwhelmingly Black anymore. There was a lot of young whites and Asian Americans, etc. You see, and here you have an example where they're out demonstrating on something which the demonstration itself is strengthening constantly, right? Because they're making these links, and it's actual fact, not just a moral demand, but an actual fact of experience that there's something enriching and making these contacts and getting to know these people and having a sense that we're together and so on. So it's that self-feeding feature, which, anyway, maybe I'm making too much of that, maybe no, but I feel we gotta be optimistic, right? Be optimistic.
Yeah, I hope I have the authority and to thank you, everybody, for this gift that you gave us today, being together and yes, giving us a good example of a form of deliberation, common deliberation. So thank you very much, Charles. Thank you.